Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the eLearning Unlocked podcast. I'm Jill Chester, the founder of Little Man Project, a bespoke development company that specialises in developing learning experiences for charities and the third sector. This podcast runs alongside our eLearning Unlocked Blended Learning programme. This programme supports learning and development professionals in charities to design effective e-learning for their staff and volunteers. In this 8th episode, Jennifer Compton, Director of Learning at Little Man Project, discusses accessibility with Susi Miller. Susi is an e-learning accessibility expert, author of the accessibility equivalent of the Holy Grail and a keynote speaker on accessibility. They discuss the top accessibility issues organisations creating e-learning are facing, the benefits of accessibility audits, and the limitations of authoring tools.
Good morning, Susi. Thank you so much for coming onto our eLearning Unlocked podcast.
You're welcome.
Good morning. So for those of you who don't know, Susi has been working in learning and development for more than 30 years. She is an industry leading expert, I would say the industry leading expert on accessible learning within e-learning. I have read her book. I have been very lucky to have been trained by her and also following all of their blogs. They're a massive source of information. So really, really grateful to have you here, Susi, to give your advice.
Welcome. It's lovely
Thank
to be
you
here.
so much. Thank you. So, Susi, before we kind of start talking a bit about your work and everything, I'm really interested to know what kind of inspired you to specialise in accessibility and e-learning. Like, kind of what happened, like what led you down that path?
So I suppose kind of recently, so my background is in L&D, so I started off like a lot of people in kind of classroom teaching, and I moved into then kind of facilitating and a lot of systems training. And I suppose, and then moved kind of more into the digital side of things. And I suppose it was, there's probably a story that you might know in the book about kind of my first experiences in the classroom when I was working in a school in Zimbabwe and being really, really privileged to work with a student that was blind and privileged to kind of have that experience, but also absolutely terrified of not knowing what to do and having absolutely no idea of how to make any learning content accessible. But I think the impact of kind of overcoming those kind of, my fears and my not really having any idea what to do and seeing the impact that it directly made on someone have really, really lasted with me. And I think that has always been something that I've kind of realized, not only the impact that it can make, but also the fact that if you can, the more you learn about accessibility and allowing everyone to have equal access, better it is for everybody. And I think that was a huge lesson when I started my own journey. So I think that's something that's kind of always kind of weaved in through everything that I've done.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? So impactful. And straight away, you're touching on one of the big misconceptions, really, that, accessibility in e-learning is for people with disabilities, but actually that's not the case at all.
Yeah, I think that I suppose the thing that I've learned since then is the fact that, it's irrefutable that it improves the learning experience for everybody. And I think then that the very first seed, and then another kind of experience I had was when I was working as a facilitator, and I was just moving into doing online content, and I had absolutely no idea about accessibility, digital accessibility, assistive technology. And I was very, very lucky to have someone that gave me some feedback and said that the learning content that she tested for me, she couldn't use with her screen reader. I had no idea what a screen reader was. I had no idea what to do, but just again, seeing the impact that she couldn't actually access the learning. And I was really, really, again, really privileged to have her show me was, again, I just thought that, this was a world that I had no idea of, this digital accessibility and assistive technology. And it was just so, so seeing her actually understanding what I needed to do. I mean, it took me a long time to find out what I needed to do, but once I did, the impact that it had on her, that she was actually able to access that content, whereas before she couldn't. That was another thing that really kind of made me think that this is something that I must, I must do. It's not good enough. It's not good enough to say
Absolutely.
I'm creating learning content, I'm keeping up
No.
with all the industry kind of, trends, etc. But I have
Yeah.
no idea about accessibility and how it's impacting so many of my audience.
How long ago was that, Susie, if you don't mind me asking?
So the first experience was when I was about, it was my first one of my first teaching jobs. So it was about, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago probably. And the other one was when I was working in local government. So that was probably about 10 years ago.
Wow. Wow. So for those of you who don't know, Susie has published a book all about accessible learning content. The subheading is A Practical Guide to Applying Best Practice Accessibility Standards to L&D Resources. And it really is. It's a completely practical resource. And, if you're starting out your journey within accessibility and e-learning, essentially there isn't any guidance that is directly for e-learning out there. So we actually follow the WCAG guidelines. That's kind of the closest guidelines that can help us to create accessible e-learning, which is brilliant, but it is hundreds and hundreds of pages with subclauses, and it's all down to interpretation. So the great thing about Susie's book is it tries to decode, what that means and really help you to interpret these individual guidelines into how that can relate. What does the 4 accessible profiles mean in terms of how I actually do it in practice with my e-learning? So obviously you just said that that was 10 years ago. The experience with the screen reader. You published your book in 2021, so like 7 years of that picking over in your brain. And like, how did you decide, do you know what, I'm going to write a book about this?
So I think the main thing for me was just going through the pain myself of trying to, get exactly this as you described. When you first start accessibility, you go to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they are the underpinning guidelines for any digital learning content. But I think when I looked at them, like so many other people, I just thought, I have no idea where to start. This is just so overwhelming. And I spent such a long time trying to understand it and trying to decode it that I just thought, well, there must be so many other people that are going through, the same painful experience as me. And there were so many people even that I was working with. So I moved after being in local government, I moved into the university sector. And there were people that I was working with that were just, and it's really, really common and understandable, just saying, this is just too complicated. You must be joking. It can't apply to what we're doing. And I just thought that is such, if I can do anything at all to help other people, avoid the kind of process that I went through, then that's worth doing. And I have to say, I had the most terrible imposter syndrome.
I was just about to say that. It must have felt so daunting.
It was awful, because I was thinking, well, who am I? I'm an instructional designer working in a university, and this is my interpretation of the standards, and the way and the framework that I came up with was just a way that I could make sense of it. And I think that is what, if you're working in L&D, that is one of the skills that you develop, is you have to be able to understand something. And we know that before you can really, if you're going to create a good piece of learning content, you really need to understand what you're doing to explain it to other people. And that was really what happened to me with when I was, going through the standards and thinking that, if you haven't ever seen them, there's just a list of, now 86 standards divided into 4 kind of categories, which really didn't help me to apply things practically. And I couldn't find anything that I was looking for. So it was really just my own kind of a way of making it make sense to me. And I thought, well, okay, even if I was expecting when I published the book to have a lot of pushback for people saying, oh, we don't agree, I don't agree with the way that you've interpreted this one. I haven't actually, and that it was really hard, but I was willing to kind of do that, because I thought, well, at least then there's a discussion in our industry. Not everybody may agree with what I've come up with, but at least, we can have a discussion about, well, okay, let's do something that actually is better and come up with, something that actually really does help people. And I think the other thing, because I was working in both in higher education and in public sector, was that I felt that there really needed to be something that was affordable, that people could, I mean, I'd gone down the route of doing, there's lots of accessibility support out there, but it's very much aimed towards people who are in web development, who are, who are coders and have that technical background, which isn't necessarily relevant when you're using an authoring tool. And I really wanted there to be just something that it wasn't necessarily a huge training program, but you could just have something to get you started. As I say, whether you disagree with some of the interpretations, it was just something to kind of really get people feeling that it was something that they could tackle.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think we've been creating accessible e-learning for, I think, 3 years now. And I mean, I have contacted you and we've had discussions about kind of little isms where I just mean in terms of that interpretation, it's an ongoing conversation, isn't it? It's happening even at a very high level within people who are or have been creating accessible e-learning for a long time. So ultimately, we're all trying to do a better job. The guidelines that are specific for e-learning aren't there yet, but we're following these guidelines and we're all interpreting what is the best solution in every single instance when we're creating e-learning. So that brings me on to my question. What do you think the top issues, or what are the top issues that the organizations you're working with to help them create accessible e-learning? What issues are they facing right now?
So I suppose there's kind of two categories. There's the category of people who are already engaged. So that's that's probably the people that you're referring to most. But then I think it's also important to kind of remember that there are still organizations who aren't on board with accessibility. So they're slightly different. That's kind of something I'll talk about in a minute. But from the organizations that are already kind of engaged with accessibility, I think the key things that we're seeing is, as you were saying, it's keeping up to date. So the new WCAG 2.2 standards have just come in. That's 9 new standards that organizations need to be aware of. We also have changes in legislation. So I think that is something that is having a real impact. So the European Accessibility Act, I'm sure you'll
coming soon.
coming in 2025. And you'll be hearing a lot more about. I think the implication of that is the fact that it's applicable not only to public sector and third sector, but also to the private sector. And I think that's a huge change in the legislation. So I think more and more organisations will begin to realise that it's something that they need to be aware of.
And some organisations listening to us might be thinking, well, unfortunately, or depending on which side of the fence you sit on, we're not in Europe anymore. We're not part of the European Union, but this legislation is going to still impact us.
Yeah, I think it's any organisation that is dealing with anyone in the EU will be impacted by that, because it does cover anyone headquartered. They don't have to be in the EU. It's anyone that is actually doing business with their EU clients. So we have quite a lot of EU clients, and we're certainly finding more EU clients are coming to us because of this new legislation. So I think the impact, and interestingly, this also has, I mean, there's still quite a lot of questions around it about exactly what it's going to how it's going to impact. But I think the fact that it will. The other thing that, as I say, that is going to have an impact is that for the first time it has quite hefty fines involved in it, and even with some it depends on which European country, but some European countries actually have some kind of prison sentences as well.
Wow. So
it's a little bit more like the GDPR, the emphasis that we had on when GDPR came in. I think that hopefully it will have some impact on the accessibility.
And so the sector that we're involved in, as you know, we specialise in working with or creating e-learning for charities, not-for-profits in the third sector.
Yeah.
So the requirements for charities is obviously more right now than in the private sector in the UK. So we're obviously talking about kind of the legislative requirements, but obviously there are so many more reasons to have accessible e-learning, and without a doubt the moral implications are pretty obvious to most people, but there's so many more things, reputational, the engagement in terms of the learners. If you're actually creating things that are good quality and accessible from the get-go. It's going to build your reputation in terms of the quality of the learning that you're creating, extends your reach. There's all sorts of other benefits, aren't there? It's really the legal aspect is kind of the lowest in some ways.
I think there's a statistic that has been really handy when I've been talking to clients recently, and that's come from a new research from Boston Consultancy Group, and they have done quite extensive research. And what they found was that although most organisations think that relatively few employees have disabilities or health conditions, they usually estimate about 4% to 7%, and that can be based on kind of people who have reported that they have a disability. But in their survey, and this is why I think it's quite important to be aware of something that can back you up, is that they surveyed, I think, 28,000 people across 16 different countries. And they came out with it was actually 25% of people said they had a disability or a health condition that limited a major life activity. And for me, it's very difficult to say, well, it will be 25% of your audience. But for me, that is so significant in thinking, well, if I want my learning content to have an impact on people, how can I be excluding up to 25% of my audience? Even for me, as an instructional designer, that is just something that it is
Definitely.
the ethical side of it, but it's just not logical. Why would I spend so long trying to create a great piece of learning if up to 25% of people won't be able to access it? But from an organizational point of view, that is multiplied so many times, because
and that's only the people about, people, if they haven't disclosed to the organization or they have temporary or changing access needs, then that wouldn't even be included in that statistic anyway.
So I think that is a great statistic to have, to kind of show the impact that's having. But I think, coming back to your question about the what are organizational, what the organizational issues that people are dealing with, I think one of the main things that we see is that as well as the changes that you need to be up with all the time, it's actually practically, how do you do this? So the main things for us are upskilling your staff, your teams, to be able to create and to be able to test content to make sure it's accessible. And also, the idea of a huge thing is always remediating existing content. We always work with organizations that have libraries and libraries.
That's incredibly difficult, isn't it? Incredibly difficult.
So it's that idea of kind of having a strategy of how you're going to upskill your staff and how you're going to deal with it, which I find is helpful moving forward. But then there's that whole piece of knowing what you're going to do about your content that needs remediation. So that's something that we've worked with a lot.
So, I mean, top tip there really is you need to be building accessibility in right from the beginning of a project, because it's a lot easier than doing that remediation. It's double as easy as then when you're being handed a source file from someone else who's created the e-learning. And ultimately, even if other people are able to tell you, what issues there are with the e-learning, if you're the one who's having to fix it, understanding what those issues are and being familiar with access tech will help you to do that process. Obviously, it's a learning curve, isn't it? And I think the more work you do on remediation, the more the impact it is on your own learning content. That's certainly something that I've found, is we do a lot of auditing at eLaHub, and seeing the issues that we see in other learning content really, really makes you, when you're creating your own content, it really makes you aware of of the pitfalls that you can fall into, and it's a great experience. So tell me a bit about some of the audits that you perform, because obviously we've worked together over a period of time, so I do know a bit about them, but obviously some of our listeners won't. So I'd just be really interested to know kind of what's involved in an accessibility audit, and also kind of the top things that you might find.
Okay. So that's quite a big one to unpack, but so
Sorry.
I suppose that's fine. No, not at all. No. Just pull me back if I start wandering off. So I think from the main thing for me is the I suppose how our auditing process has evolved since we've started. So when we started, we were very much we were looking at the experience of organizations who are doing web accessibility audits and kind of basing everything on that. Over probably the four or 5 years that we've been doing audits, we've really kind of evolved our own practice. And that practice is very much based around empowering people to understand the issues and to be able to correct them themselves. So rather than just being an audit, which typically just kind of lists all of the things that are wrong, it looks more at, yes, it identifies any, WCAG violations that are in the learning. But it also, wherever possible, especially because we have all of our testers have got L&D background, and a lot of our testers are also developers. So if we have a developer who has specifically got experience of using that authoring tool, then we can give really targeted remediation. If we don't, we can still give, a good indication and say, well, we need to find out how to do this with your authoring tool. So it's really, really targeted. It's what we call active auditing.
That's such a difference.
It is so important that we are empowering that, and that normally in our work with clients, that normally runs alongside people doing our online program that we've put together, which goes through all of the WCAG standards. So hand in hand, our kind of audit is showing people, these are the issues that we've identified. This is how you can improve them. But the background and the reason why you're doing it comes from the program that people are quite often doing at the same time as they're going through, as we're going through the audit. But I think the really, really key thing for me is that we have a section on the WCAG standards and, as I say, any violations and how to work with them, how to correct them. But then we also have a section on usability and the inclusive side of things. And for me, that is almost where you get just as much, if not better, information that we need to share with you to help you improve your learning content. So it is things that wouldn't necessarily be normally we're auditing to a WCAG level AA standard. So anything A or AA is kind of in the issues. But in this section, we do AAA requirements, because some of those AAA requirements really have have a really positive impact on the learning. And also we kind of give anything that are not necessarily a WCAG standard, but things such as plain language, which will improve things like. And so it's that usability and that inclusivity, making sure that your imagery, for example, is truly inclusive. Are you using that idea of not using click? And that is not a WCAG standard, but it's something that can really help. What kind of alternative text are you using to describe your images, for example? Those kind of recommendations that we've kind of based on so much experience of working with other organizations really, really makes a difference to the audits that we're delivering now.
Just going back to kind of the difference between different types of organizations doing audits, obviously, because we have had to make recommendations in the past to charities looking to potentially get accessibility audits done. We have certainly experienced, the difference in terms of the offering that you're talking about. So I think there's nothing more daunting than knowing that you're not doing what you need to be doing, other than then being sent a massive Excel document with 20 sheets and hundreds of cells saying fail, but then not having the skills, knowledge, just being left in this kind of black hole worrying, well, what do I do now? They haven't given me any tips how to potentially solve some of those issues. And you just touched on
some of the issues as well, just to interrupt, some of the issues are based on underlying coding, and that very often with authoring tools is not something that you have any control over. So again, our approach, because we understand the authoring tools and the limitations of those authoring tools, because we've gone through the same thing ourselves, our approach is much more pragmatic. Okay, what can we do about it? If the tool isn't allowing you to do this, but maybe the client is saying they want this, or this is it absolutely instrumental for the learning, what approach can we come up with? Can we come up with an alternative? Can we come up with something that is accessible, but you can still maybe keep the kind of approach that you've got in there? Or do we put this in an accessibility statement? Or it's that kind of pragmatic approach to understanding it's not perfect, but we
Yeah.
can do a lot to make it better as long as we can understand why it is causing problems, and that then is the key to being able to think of some solutions to what, to the issues. And
Yeah.
it's inescapable that everybody who's using an authoring tool they're going to have limitations, and every organization will have organizational requirements that means that some things won't be accessible. So it's just needing
Yeah,
to have
totally.
a straightforward kind of pragmatic approach to making
And
it
being
as
open
good
and
as you possibly,
honest.
and being open and honest about it.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we see is organizations getting authoring tools that pitch as accessible, and therefore they believe that straight away they're accessible out of the box, which is just not the case.
I agree. Yeah.
You absolutely have to change and enhance each interaction on a case by case basis. And you just touched on there the different standards. So you just mentioned AAA. Obviously some of the listeners might not know
Okay.
fully about
Fine.
some of
Yeah,
those
sorry.
things. No, I think they probably will. So essentially the web content accessibility guidelines contain 3 different levels: A, AA, and AAA. AA is the mid-level, covers most of the common barriers to access, and again most public sector organizations are working within that level ideally. But yeah, talking about some of the limitations of authoring tools, there is a AAA standard, but unfortunately a lot of the time, or certainly some of the time, we're not able to achieve those standards yet. We're still chasing our tail in terms of what capabilities the software has that you're using. So that's why it's really important to stay up to date with the guidelines, but also to stay up to date with what your authoring tool capabilities are and changes. And
yeah, full-time job.
Full-time job, without a doubt. So just going back a step to some of the kind of audits that you do.
Yeah, sorry,
What
I
are
haven't told
your
you about the
no
common things.
no
Yeah.
don't worry it's so interesting. I could just talk about it all day. But what are kind of the top things that you find that when you're performing those accessibility audits with
I think the first thing that I think is really interesting is, again, it can be dependent on which type of authoring tool that has been used. So I kind of define them broadly into type 2 groups. So more template driven tools where things like Articulate, Rise, Adapt, Evolve, Elucidapt, where you kind of have, it's a bit more like content management where you've got blocks of content, and then you've got your open control tools where you have much more control as an author. So the one that many people are aware of is Storyline. But you also have Lectora, for example, and so those are the kind of open control tools. Now, what we find with the open control tools, the advantage of those type of tools is that you have more control. So if there are accessibility issues, you usually have more control of being able to fix them. The template-driven ones, very much, some of the issues are very dependent on the authoring tool. So there's something that that you may not be able to do anything about that apart from send a ticket in and wait until it
for a long
fixed.
time.
Yes, maybe. But from the open control tools, the advantage of that, as I say, you have more control. But the disadvantage is that if you don't know too much about accessibility, you have much more ability to make mistakes. So the kind of typical things we see with those authoring tools that give you more control, especially over navigation, are things such as issues with the navigation. The buttons might not have good color contrast, or they might not be consistent, or so it's anything that you've got kind of control over. Another thing that we see a lot with open control tools are heading levels. So people aren't aware that they need to use the heading levels or maybe the list levels, which are inbuilt into the tool, because that is what makes the screen reader be able to identify heading levels. And they are really important from a screen reader ability to kind of understand and process the content. So that they are key things. Also things dependent on, I suppose this applies to both, but it depends on the interactions that you have in your tool. It's really important to be aware if they are accessible or not. So a key one that we talk about a lot is the drag and drop one. So it's making sure that the interactions that you're using, again coming back to the sort of more open control ones, things like adding moving content that the learners can't control, is one that we see quite a lot. So I suppose those are the kind of key ones that we identify with those open control tools. Also things like embedding things that get announced by the screen reader. There's all kind of fiddly things that you can do by mistake in those tools. I think for kind of in generally all of them, one thing that really surprises me a lot is the fact that we still see so many color contrast issues. I think probably every audit that I've ever done has had issues with color contrast. And I say I'm surprised. So I suppose most people are aware of the text against the background color contrast. We still see a few issues with those. But I think actually the thing that isn't surprising is that it is actually quite complex color contrast, because you have issues with, it's so easy if you have a brand palette to thinking, oh, if I use these colors, I'll be fine. But it's the combination of colors that causes the problem. So you might have one color that you use and it's fine with this color, but you use it with another one. So it's quite important to kind of test all of those.
A lot of the time, the brand colours are not accessible as well. Like, it's quite surprising how many organisations, straight from the top are using colour palettes that are not accessible. Full stop.
Yeah. So the other thing I think that is slightly complicated about color is the fact that you also have, as well as the text against background, you also have the user interface element. So navigation items, buttons, for example, that has a color contrast. Any images that, graphs, for example, they will have a color contrast requirement as well, and people quite often are not aware of that. And the other thing that often causes problems is the visible focus indicator. So if you've got an authoring tool that can change the color of that visible focus indicator for keyboard users, that also has a color contrast requirement. And again, it's so many different things to be aware of that people just either they forget them or they overlook them in certain cases. So it is quite tricky to get right.
But not a reason to feel scared or not do it, because actually, if you did 60% or 70 or maybe 80% of the really practical things that we know makes a massive difference, then you are going to make a significant impact on that experience for a vast amount of learners. Yes, you might still be fiddling about with the 20% or need help with interpreting it, but things like the color contrast, getting the focus order right so that things feel like it's in a logical order, all of those things, actually they are simple, takes a bit of learning, but they make a massive difference.
Definitely. So I suppose the other ones that spring to mind also are links always cause problems. So it's that link text of making sure that your learners know where they're going to, so the avoiding the click here and things like that. And interestingly, one we see quite often is people who only identify links using color, which obviously if someone is colorblind, that causes an issue. So we see that quite often. And also the color, using color alone, we see quite often in learning when it comes to feedback. So for example, you have a colored overlay that tells you that, a red overlay will tell you that you've got your question wrong. And obviously if you're colorblind, or you've got vision access needs, using a screen reader, that means nothing to you. So that's another common one. So I think knowing as much as you can about your tool when it comes to how so especially when I think of the interactions, is what the kind of the first thing that I think about when you're looking at your tool is if it has a conformance report, an accessibility conformance report, or a VPAT. It's based on a VPAT, the voluntary product accessibility template. That's something when we're working with authoring tools, is that we're encouraging them to have that at the very least available, because that just makes your life so much easier. So for example, if you know, if you're using an authoring tool, that some of the interactivity, like the drag and drop, isn't accessible, and that's that up front, then that's fine. You know what to do about that, rather than you having to go through that, or test it yourself, or go to an expert, an accessibility expert, to tell you that it's not accessible. So that's a really important step.
Definitely. And I think, as an instructional designer, we want to make sure that the learning that we're creating creates an impact, both for the learner and for the organization, in terms of, what they want to achieve. And when you start getting into accessibility, there are moments where you think, do you know what? I am never going to use a drag and drop ever again. That's the solution. And actually, that's not the answer. Primary focus has to be, what is the best way that I can communicate creating interactions to achieve the learning.
Yeah.
Then, okay, if the answer has to be a drag and drop, theoretically,
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue 95% of the time it doesn't necessarily have to be a drag and drop. People just decide this will be fun. So if absolutely to achieve the learning it has to be a drag and drop in this instance, then okay, well, what alternative interaction can we do? And actually, we don't like to use alternatives, and you shouldn't be using alternatives ultimately, you know, because that's not really best practice. You're just straight away othering in terms of the interaction. But the main thing is,
I don't know. I think that is something that you know, that some people feel very, very strongly about that, and I think that's absolutely fine. I can completely understand that point of view. I think, again, coming back to my own practical experience and trying to be as pragmatic as possible, I think the idea of giving alternatives for me, and this is my, you know, this is my strategy. So people may not agree with it, but my strategy is that if I provide an alternative, so for example, if you think about video content, we provide, you know, it is good accessibility practice to provide alternatives, to provide captions, to provide transcripts, to provide audio description, because you are then making it accessible for people with different types of accesses, and it kind of goes into the learner preference as well. So for me, the kind of concept of giving alternatives isn't necessarily bad in itself. If at the heart, exactly as you touch on it, if the heart of what you're doing, you think this is best practice for your learners, this is the thing that will, you know, really help them, I don't have a problem in providing an alternative. And I tend to provide text alternatives for many, even flip, you know, even if the authoring tool will say, for example, that I've got a flip card interactivity, which it says is accessible, I still will provide a text alternative, because I know some people just don't want to be flipping through the cards. Do you know what I mean? So, and for me, that's my decision. That's what I've decided. I've kind of decided that I don't want to strip out things because of accessibility. However, I think this is where working with many different organizations has been, again, a huge privilege, but really, really helpful, because I think the key thing is, as an organization, coming to a decision on what you think you should be doing within your organization, within your team. So not everybody may agree, but at least if you have a strategy, then people know why they're doing something, and they know what to do, rather than everybody trying to come up with a solution or thinking, well, what do I need? Is this wrong? You know, should I be doing this? Should I be providing alternatives? So I think again, the experience that I've had since writing the book, of working with so many different organizations and seeing some of these, you know, the issues that they're having, just has kind of brought home how you have to, you know, there isn't always a right and a wrong answer, but if at least you can decide on a strategy together as an organization, it makes it so much easier and so much better, that consistency from the point of view, and so helpful if you are a practitioner when you're actually trying to develop and design that content.
And it's really hard if you're working on your own, because a lot of the time it requires a conversation. You know, okay, we were thinking we were going to do a drag and drop. It is the right solution, but we need to also do an alternative. What's the best alternative? Even interactions that are accessible theoretically out of the box from the get-go can actually be really laborious and not a great experience. So, for example, within our own practice, you know, hearing someone using a head stick to navigate a click to reveal, if you've got 20 things to click on a screen, theoretically it's accessible, but actually, is it necessary? It was not necessarily a great experience. So how can we kind of improve that? But that's often about a conversation, isn't it? Like having people to bounce off in your team is really useful. Like, what would you do, or what would you advise for people who don't have people they feel within their organization that, you know, they can talk to?
I think one of the things that I've started doing a bit more is being kind of a bit more open about the kind of those kind of issues. And I mean, my go-to place is LinkedIn and social media. So, but I think before, again, coming back to this imposter syndrome, I was really reluctant to say, actually, I'm not sure about this. I don't understand or when we're doing auditing now, I come, a conundrum. Does this apply to this? Or we've got a screen reader tester who's saying this doesn't work, but we can't quite work out which of the standards to put it under. There's lots of things that you sometimes just need, to talk to. And I suppose probably over the last year, I'm incredibly lucky that I have got a network of people that I can talk to. But at the beginning, I was too frightened to be discussing this because I was thinking, I should know this, and it's that the confidence of people to be able to say, actually, I need someone to bounce this off. It's like with the new standards that they came in with WCAG 2.2, which I was writing about in the second edition of the book. I was much more, well, luckily, because my network was stronger, but I was much more, okay, I don't understand how this works, and then it's talking to other people, but not saying, because at the beginning I was kind of, it's like, I should know this, but actually if you feel if it's okay to say, this is something that I need help on, what's your interpretation of this, that's such a great approach. So I suppose, if you're not sure, if you do have anyone that you can reach out to, then and again, social media is a good place to go to kind of find people.
So it's probably a good time then just to kind of recap then on who the right people are to connect with, because obviously we've had conversations separately to, being on this podcast. Within the eLearning Unlocked workbooks, we champion obviously following you on LinkedIn, obviously following the eLaHub blog, which is a fountain of knowledge. I also follow the Champions of Accessibility Network Forum on LinkedIn and the eLearning Accessibility community on LinkedIn. There are also some individuals that I know you've mentioned to me in the past. Is it helpful for you to just quickly reel off some of those people? Because it'd be great if the listeners could follow some of these people.
I must say that a lot of the information that I get about accessibility and things that are going on do stem from in my case LinkedIn. So I get a huge amount of knowledge from there. And so I suppose key people that I follow, Meryl Evans is a great one, and Harman Gurma is another great one. Both have a lived experience of a disability, so they give that kind of perspective. Then you have Diane Elkins is a great champion of accessibility, especially in Articulate products. Then also Michael Osborne, he has recently just started his own company. He's a great one that's posting stuff about accessibility. The Microsoft, there's Michael Bamish and Jenny Flurry. They post a lot, and they also post a lot of resources, which are really, really helpful. And then Chris Holloway is another one who's posts a lot of really useful accessibility information. So sometimes it tends to be the accessibility information can be not specifically for learning content, but it's that kind of general approach. And I think once you start following, and Gemma, another one from Mint Learning, she's great on accessibility as well. So I think once you start following people, then things pop up on your feed. Definitely. And then you kind of get your network going. So I think you
go down into a rabbit hole there.
You can, But I think the message for me would be, if anything, ask questions to people, and don't be afraid of thinking that you should know, you should know all the answers, because I don't think you can ever know what we know, that you can never know all the answers about accessibility.
And anyone who says that they are, the world's expert and they cannot learn anything else about accessibility because they know every single thing is, I would argue, not necessarily telling the full truth.
It makes me feel a bit uncomfortable when people say that I'm an eLearning accessibility expert.
You are an expert, but you
I'm not going to say that you say I am.
You said to me many times, yes, but it's still a journey, and I don't know everything, and it's interpretation.
You say that, but you literally think, how did I not know that? How have I been doing this for this long and still not suddenly the penny drops after 10 years, and you suddenly think, why did I not understand that kind of thing? So it's that. I mean, things do change all the time, so that is keeping on. But there are still things that surprise myself in not having known
Yeah,
or
and
misunderstood.
we're all on a journey together. And
Yes, I
actually,
agree.
the more that we can share our knowledge and our practice together, then it's just going to be better for everyone. So there's no
Definitely.
point in being protectionist about what you know within your
No,
own
I agree.
organization.
Yeah.
The more you can share with others, the better. And,
Yeah.
you have shared with me your knowledge many, many times. And actually, one of the things that is great is there are now talks which are starting to pop up.
Yeah.
Specifically
Definitely.
on e-learning accessibility.
Yeah.
So I know we're doing one for the Charity Learning
Uh-huh.
Consortium, which is specific to the work we do within
Yeah.
e-learning. But I know that there is a learning tech day coming up in Edinburgh. I know because I'm
Yeah.
going. I'm really looking forward to it. You're talking. I think
Yeah.
Gemma's talking. Lots of other people are
Michael's
going to be
talking as
talking.
well. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's
So
going to be a
that's
great
great.
day.
To have a day on accessibility is something that you couldn't even have dreamed of 5 years ago when I
And
started
really low
eLaHub.
cost because,
Yeah.
to get your learning network membership,
Yeah.
I think is it like 25 or 35 pounds or something.
Uh-huh.
So, and
Yeah.
then they're running all these great events, but
Yeah.
to be able to
Brilliant.
go for a whole day with
Yeah.
experts in this area.
Yeah.
There are also other online courses, online forums. So like the Access
Yes.
conference, that was a couple of months ago, wasn't it, from
Yeah.
memory?
Yeah.
So not for a while, but again, is available. So
Yeah.
everyone tap up those things. Your last version of your book was published in
Okay.
2001, but there's
Yeah.
a new one coming out.
Yes.
Tell me
In
about it.
January. Okay, so that's coming out in January, and I think the impetus for that, the kind of the publisher kind of wanting to do a second edition was basically the 2.2 standards coming out. So there's 9 new standards. So that, as I say, I think I mentioned before, that kind of brings up those standards to 86 standards that you need to be aware of. That includes all 3 levels. And if you're working to A, which includes A and sorry, if you're working to AA, which includes A and AA, that's 55 standards to be aware of. So I think that was the main reason for writing it. It was for me just such a huge opportunity to be able to revisit my imposter syndrome and to be able to include the experience that I've had since writing the first edition. So all of the work that I've done since writing that first edition, like I was saying, working with organizations kind of allowed me to really have evidence-based kind of input. So things like, the business, more of the business side of things. So things like maturity models, things like tackling, we were talking about remediating content, how you test learning, for example. I've got a matrix in there, which is the testing matrix, how you can shift your learning, your kind of accessibility testing left, so you do it earlier. So there's kind of things that I've learned that have been really impactful in the organizations that I've worked with that I could add, which I think has, for me, I feel the imposter syndrome has kind of turned into, it's still not perfect, but I feel much more confident that I've got the experience and the, working with organizations that can really kind of show that this is the evidence behind what I'm saying. Whereas before it was, this is my interpretation, but it was only me and a handful of colleagues that I was working on. This is kind of real, experience and evidence based. Also, I think for me, I had the experience of finding out that I actually was dyslexic in between writing this book and the second. And I think that had a huge impact as well on me in understanding this idea of my dyslexic skills. So before, I was kind of like always, I kind of always suspected that I was dyslexic, but had never had an assessment. And finding out that I was really made me more confident in the fact that it was my dyslexic skills that had allowed me to kind of work through. It's this idea of making the complex simple, and the strengths that I had with being dyslexic that really kind of made me much more confident when I was writing the book and thinking, this is I have got a lived experience of being dyslexic, and I've also got a lived experience of how much that has affected my confidence in the past. And really thinking now, for me, and I think for many people who have a late diagnosis, it was truly transformational, because I really understood the way that my brain was working. And yes, the things that I know that I struggle with, the processing, etc., I could still say, well, yes, I know now. I said to my editor, with referencing,
Yeah.
it's something that I hate, and it takes me so long, and I can't process it. I can't
Yeah.
see the referencing. Do you know what I mean? I struggle with that.
Yeah.
And instead of struggling for hours and hours, I just said to my editor, look, I'm really sorry, but I'm really struggling with that because of my dyslexic processing. And he was, and it was just so liberating to be able to say, this is because the way that my brain is, not because I'm lazy. It's not because I really hate doing which, but it's because I can't do it. I literally can't see what's going on when I'm trying to do this. So, and then it was the confidence of like, yes, the hours and hours and hours and hours and hours that I've spent trying to make this straightforward is, it's because I need to understand it myself. It's the way that my brain works, but actually that has a really positive impact on being able to help other people as well. So it was that whole, there was a tiny bit of joy in writing it, whereas before it was the complete
Stress.
Imposter syndrome, thinking who am I, what am I doing? Whereas now it was like, yes, I do feel that, and especially as we were saying, because the industry has, we're nowhere near where we need to, but the industry has started taking this seriously, and understanding how important it is, I think is something that again, hopefully really comes across in the book.
I am so looking forward to getting it. So it is going to be, I will be one of the first people to buy, and I will also be expecting a signed signature inside, as per last time.
Very welcome.
Is there anything else that you would like to say, Susi? You have answered all of my questions. Obviously, I would highly recommend everyone to try and attend the Accessibility Day to connect with you. Is there anything that you feel we haven't covered today?
I think the one thing probably that we didn't, which I know I missed out, was when we were talking about organizations and their priorities. And we were talking, I said about, we were really addressing organizations that were already on board with accessibility, which is brilliant. I think one of the things that I'd kind of like to finish with is this idea that there are still a lot of organizations who are not on board with accessibility, and there are a lot of people working at grassroots level in those organizations, as probably we've all experienced at some point, who are frustrated by the fact that the organizations that they're working with are not on board with accessibility. So I think the thing about that I would say, obviously, so from a kind of organizational point of view, you need that leadership input. I completely agree, for there to be a kind of strategic approach to accessibility. However, I think one of the things that always strikes me when I'm training people and working with people is, again, at a grassroots level, is the impact that you can make yourself as a practitioner. So, and I think that impact is, as you were saying before, you don't need to be someone who is able to maybe understand and implement all of those 86 standards, but anything that you can do, whether it's adding captions. That was one of the things I forgot about the audits, is one of the things that we see all the time is issues with video and audio content, not having captions, not having transcripts, not having audio description. So, but anything that you can do, making sure you add alternative text, checking your color contrast, using plain language, that consistency, for example, makes such a huge difference to your learners. And I think also you start building that confidence in the fact that, when you're starting off, again, it can be very overwhelming. Any little step that you take is that progress over perfection is making, a real impact on your own practice, and also on your learning content and the experience of your learners. However, for me, that is and I've seen it over and over again, it's kind of a catalyst. When someone starts doing it, then it kind of, they become the accessibility person in the team, and then that slowly spreads out to other people realizing, and then you have oh, I've created this learning content and I've done this to it and we've had this really great feedback, then you have evidence that you can start feeding up to your management, and then it can slowly it builds and builds. So I suppose the message is, it can feel very frustrating if you're struggling to get, and I certainly went through that myself in various organizations. It can feel so demoralizing if you're not getting that, but I think it's giving it time and realizing that it's the power that you have as an individual, as a practitioner, to be able to do something to your own learning content and improve it, which often spreads into then it's that bottom up. As I say, it can take time. The other thing that I see is that quite often when we work with organizations, it's the learning team that it starts off with that practical, this is what we're going to do, these are the strategies that we're going to implement it. And then that kind of snowballs. And I've seen so often organizational commitment to accessibility starting with a learning team and then spreading out. So one of the things that we do as well as focusing on learning, we also do just digital accessibility awareness workshops. And they very, very often, we've done whole organizations delivered them to hundreds of people, starting off because someone in the learning team gets on board with accessibility, and then it spreads, and then people see the impact it has and the positive, not only to the content itself, but also to that whole, the whole kind of the culture of an organization, and it really can have such a huge impact. So it can feel really frustrating, but it's the don't give up, because really everybody does have that power to be able to do something, starting off maybe small, but it really does spread
big. Creating a big impact. Absolutely. The perfect place to end, I think, Susie. It's a journey. Start your journey, because you can really create a big impact. And definitely you've shown us that, and we're loving what we're doing. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Very welcome.
And really looking forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much, Susie.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure about accessibility. I could have done another hour.
Me too.
Luckily, it's not me.
Have me. Thank you, Susie.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Bye.